Hello, this is my oral presentation number 4. I will be discussing the Devonian extinction. The Devonian extinction was one of the 5 major extinction periods that have happened throughout Earth's history. This extinction happened between the Devonian period and the Carboniferous period, about 359 million years ago, and it spanned about 20 million years. We will begin with the time leading up to the mass extinction. This, of course, was the Devonian period. This period lasted from about 419 to 359 million years ago. It was a time of relative peace on Earth. There weren't the large number of meteor impacts as there had been in the past, and there wasn't a whole lot of volcanic activity at this time either. This peace allowed for the life on Earth to take hold and do its own thing, and it let evolution really work its magic. And we can see this by looking at the fossil records from this particular time period. What we see is a large diversification of fish life in the seas, and in the coral reefs at this time, they grew drastically. There was more coral reef growth during this time than there has been at any other time in Earth's history. And while this ocean life is important in its own respect, the most notable part about the Devonian period was the growth of life on land. And to be clear, there was life on land, plant and animal life on land before this period, but it was always in very small numbers, and very few species were able to live on land. It was during this time period when this land life really proliferated and started to expand across the entire landscape of Earth. Now, it's interesting that a time of such growth in the amount of life and the amount of species would lead to a mass extinction. But this is exactly what happened, and many scientists believe that this is actually part of the cause for why the extinction happened. So the end of the Devonian period, the Devonian mass extinction, this period lasted for about 20 million years. The boundaries of this time are a little uncertain, but that's because it's hard to pinpoint exactly when animals started to die. The fossil record certainly is not full enough to make that clear marker. The next logical question is, what is the cause of the mass Devonian extinction? The cause of any mass extinction of the past is very hard to determine. There's always the chance that meteor impacts, volcanic eruptions, general climate change were large contributing factors. But for this particular extinction, there is evidence that there were a couple of other things that had large contributions. One of which was the lowered CO2 levels in the atmosphere. The reason why these CO2 levels seems to be fairly apparent. The Devonian period was a time of proliferation of terrestrial plant life. These plants, of course, as they do now, they did photosynthesis. Photosynthesis takes in carbon dioxide out of the air and replaces it with oxygen, in general terms. And so as the amount of plants grew, the amount of carbon dioxide being taken out of the atmosphere grew as well. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, meaning that less of it makes the Earth cooler. And this cooling of the Earth must have caused glaciation, because in the geological records we can see that the sea levels at this time were lower than they were during the Devonian period. During the extinction, they were lower than they were during the Devonian period. The simple lowering of the sea levels had a dramatic effect on sea life at the time. most notably, coral reefs were drastically affected. Some of these coral reefs were killed by the lowered sea levels because they were too close to the surface and they were actually exposed to the air, which of course killed them. And and some of the sea life was killed off by the lowering sea levels in other more indirect ways. There would be some fish that lived close to the shores, and as the sea levels lowered, they were pushed kind of away and into deeper, cooler waters, away from the shores. And this, of course, killed a good portion of them off because they were not, they, their bodies were not designed to live in those particular conditions. In addition to this, geologists have found black shales in the shallow seas near North America and Eurasia. I'm reading this from point 2 or point 3, I guess, of this slide, if you want to follow along. And they did date these shales, and they found that they are from the time period of the Devonian extinction. And what these rocks mean is they indicate a thing called anoxia. What anoxia is it's basically just a lack of oxygen in the atmosphere. And so when you're thinking about what just happened in the Devonian period with the expansion of all this plant life, it doesn't really make sense that this is the case. More plant life should mean much more oxygen, correct? It converts the CO2 into oxygen. So the oxygen levels should be sky high at this time. And while this is true, plants do that. This effect didn't happen right away. And you can see that if you look at the graph at the top right, the amount of oxygen kind of hit the low, at least in that local minimum, at about 400 or 370 million years ago, right about at the start of the Devonian extinction. And then from that point, the oxygen levels shoot all the way up to the highest they had been in 600 million years. And so that makes sense for them to shoot up like that. But the reason for it to dip down so low like that is a little unclear. But what many scientists believe, and this seems to be a fairly consistent claim, is that the soil that these plants had just started filling out, they had just moved onto land and just started to cover this soil, the soil was not accustomed to housing these plants, and so when it experienced that increase in nutrients, it had not yet become saturated with oxygen. So this soil absorbed the oxygen that would have normally gone into the oceans, thus depriving the oceans of the normal amounts of oxygen that its life had been living on previously, and subsequently killing off a large portion of that population. So we'll move on to the impact of these things that we've discussed. The anoxia in the oceans and the lowered CO2 levels leading to glaciation. And in addition to these things, the many other things which I haven't covered. It is very likely that there were many other things that contributed to the mass extinction at the end of the Devonian period, but there's not much evidence about what exactly these things are. And quite frankly, there's not a whole lot of evidence for the two causes that I have explained. But there was, slightly more evidence for those two than the others, so I decided that those two were worth mentioning while the others were not. With this being said, the effect of all of these things is known. About 70 to 75% of all animal species were wiped out during this time. While this is a large number in and of itself, what makes it even more notable is that the majority of it was marine life. And to be clear, most of life on Earth at this time was in the oceans. But still, the terrestrial life was barely affected by this extinction event. And this makes sense. The two things that I did go over, the lowered sea levels and the lower oxygen levels in the ocean, neither of these things would have much, if any, of an effect on life on land. And so this is what we see in the fossil records. And so this is another indicator pointing towards these two causes as being some of the main reasons for this extinction. In addition to the sea life, like the fish and whatnot, the coral reefs were killed off drastically. Not only were they killed off, but the organisms that build reefs, those were almost completely wiped out as well. This didn't allow any reef growth to happen on Earth for the next like 300 million years or so, up until the Triassic period. The Devonian extinction was interesting, to say the least. It came at the end of the Devonian period, which was a time of huge growth in plant life on Earth. And this seems to have had a direct effect, or a direct link to the start and continuation of the Devonian mass extinction. These plants took the CO2 out of the air, which lowered the sea levels and killed off marine life. These plants put nutrients into the soil, which took oxygen out of the ocean, which killed off this marine life. And so it's kind of funny how it seems like Earth decided at the beginning of the Devonian period that it wanted to try its hand at having terrestrial plant life, and it did, but it backfired a little bit. It didn't work out as well as I'm guessing Earth hoped. It wiped out about 70% of marine life, and but it did leave a good chunk of marine life left, and this seed of life left in the oceans, it allowed the marine life to rebuild. And if you look further down into the Carboniferous period and on, you see that plant life remained on the land of Earth, and marine life also flourished in its own realm in the oceans. And so it's like the Devonian period was the start of Earth having plant life, and the Devonian extinction was kind of rebalancing out the plant and marine life. This concludes my presentation. Thank you for watching.